Hey, welcome everyone to today's call hosted by the UK chapter of the Internet Society. We have the pleasure today to have Dr. Yik Changqin, and also Dr. David Raho. Yik Chan is an associate professor at the Beijing Normal University, and David researcher at Sheffield Hallam University. And they will present the policy report they collaborated with researchers across 4 jurisdictions: the UK, China, South Korea, and Singapore, on the topic of interoperability in AI safety governance, a huge topic out there at the moment and for some time, and quite rightly. Today, we will be focusing specifically on the United Kingdom, but we will be referencing the other parts of the world as well. And it's just worth mentioning that the report was developed through the United Nations University Institute in Macau, and it looks at a whole number of aspects, which I'm sure our colleagues here and our invitees will be better suited to explain. Since I do not wish to waste any further time, we have 1 hour. We don't have an exact hard stop. So if we need more time, we could extend for another 30 minutes afterwards if needed. So don't worry, questions can happen at the end. I hope there'll be a lot of questions and a lot of comments as well. And let's go then right away. I'll pass the floor over to Yik Changqin.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to present these topics. So our topics is about interoperability in AI safety and ethics, regulation, and standards. So it's a cross-jurisdiction study for United Kingdom, South Korea, China, and Singapore. This presentation actually is based on the policy report we collaborated under the UNU Macau's leadership. So the report actually constitutes a global report, which is the green one, and also the 4 countries report. So it's about 150 pages long, but it has 5 reports in total actually. So you can see the UK country level report, and also the South Korea, China, and the Singapore country report. And then on top of this, we have the global report. So the purpose of the report is to draw on 4 country study from China, South Korea, Singapore, and the UK to identify effective tools and the barriers to interoperability in AI safety governance. And ultimately, we develop some policy recommendation to support the creation of the interoperability mechanism to align with the Global Digital Compact, the GDC. I think most of us know that, and also the UN resolutions on AI safety governance. So in 2024, there's some very significant development at the UN level. There's 2 UN General Assembly resolution on AI. So they talk about the governance measures such as the interoperability, adaptation, inclusiveness, and extras. And besides, this GDC also reached in 2024, and which there's a part actually devoted to the AI safety governance and AI governance in general. They talk about the coordination, interoperability, and compatibility of the emerging AI governance framework, which is Objective 5 of the GDC. So they talk about different mechanisms, so I don't have time to go through. If you are interested, you can read our report. And by the way, you can scan this QR code to download the report. You just scan it and you can download from the website. So why do we choose the topics of interoperability? Because interoperability is the central goal of AI governance. Because the AI governance basically needs to have a international collaboration and coordination, as most of us recognized. And it's also vital for reduce risk, foster innovation, enhance the competitiveness, and promote realization and build public trust. So we particularly choose focus on 3 high-stake domains, which are autonomous vehicle, education, and cross-border data flow. The reason for us to choose these 3 domains is because the risk, the salient risk they pose to the society and to individual. For example, the risk to the right of privacy, the right to life, the right to equitable access to the knowledge and the digital literacy, data security, and also cyber security. So that's why we choose these 3 domains. So first of all, before we move to the detailed framework, we want to define the terms. So what is the safety of AI system? So when we talk about the safety of AI system, we talk about the understanding, prevention, mitigation, and management of potential harms arising from the life cycle of AI development. So AI safety governance actually is about frameworks, policy, and practical solution, which to maintain the safety, reliable, and ethical way of AI development, also to reduce risk and avoid harm to individual and to the society. So interoperability is quite a difficult concept. But in general, when we talk about interoperability, even from the internet governance, from cybersecurity or the infrastructure point of view, when we talk about interoperability, we talk about the ability of different system tools and components to work together, and both technically and normatively. So this is the general concept of interoperability. So when we talk about the interoperability of AI governance, it's particularly referred to the essential substantive enable two or more jurisdictions to collaboration in terms of the support, common understanding, interpretation, and implementation of transport AI safety governance. This is the definition of the interoperability of AI governance in our report. So in terms of the three key aspects of interoperability, which include ethics, legal, and technical interoperability. So when we talk about the ethical interoperability, it means the ability of institutions, system, or actors to collaborate across different moral framework. So when we talk about legal interoperability, it means the coordination of regulatory framework to establish the international collaboration mechanism. So when we talk about technical interoperability, actually we refers to the two or more systems to exchange information or to use the information, which focus on to ensure enable the system can communicate and work together. So technical interoperability actually includes two aspects, which are the vertical and the horizontal interoperabilities. So the method we adapt in our research is the regulatory learning. What is regulatory learning? This is referred to the learning from domestic experiments, idea, experience, and insight of other jurisdictions or communities. So it's basically it's bottom-up approach. So look at the interjurisdictional learning and the regulatory innovation. And based on that, then we determine what are the most suitable regulatory response to the challenge posed by the AI. That's why we have a 4-country report first. And we generated our 5 based on the 4-country reports. So this report is led and coordinated by the UNU Institute in Macau. So it's an initiative to provide a new approach to transnational policymaking. So we have a 4-country teams, but also have a global teams, which is led by the UNU Macau. And so we work together to define the shared challenge and also the methodology we developed together as a whole team. And also we generated a practical solution based on the local report. So when we do the comparative studies, we have used the framework. The framework is to compile the AI governance across 4 jurisdictions. So the framework have 7 elements, which objective of the governance, the framework, and principle and the values, governance approach, whether it's top-down or bottom-up, and the binding, whether they're binding or non-binding, and also level of integration, which means that what the domestic framework integrated to the global regional framework, then the regulator and also components. So you can have a look of so just give you an example. This is a China framework, and this is South Korea's framework. So we analyze for the China's cross-border data governance framework and also for the South Korea's. So the other things that we also look at is the interoperabilities, the integratory measures, each jurisdiction aligned with the global or regional AI governance framework. For example, in here, we talk about the autonomous vehicles. So we're comparing of AI safety governance interoperability of the 4 jurisdictions. For example, China, what are their technical standard alignments? What are bilateral, multilateral collaborations mechanisms? South Korea, we did the same thing under Singapore. And the UK, of course, there's a variance. They have a different patterns, but they also have a convergent aspect and a diverging as well. So the next step we did is to identify the effective interoperability instruments. So when we talk about the effectiveness, we mean 2 things. The first is about convergence, which means those instruments adopted by the most of the 4 jurisdictions. And secondly, we talk about the complementarities, which means the different governance instruments, but even they're different, but they can reinforce each other to achieve complementary performance. For example, the AI regulation can be complementary by liability rules to address the AI harms. Because if you want to address AI harms, in the end, you need to have a liability. So the liability is accountability mechanism for the AI regulation. So therefore, we also include liability rules in our effective interoperability instrument. So when we talk about the ethical interoperability, there's a few mechanisms which are used practically or theoretically. So one is about the promotion of shared or common terminology. I think all of our colleagues understand what this is about, the common or shared terminology. The second is a compatible cross-institutional ethical assessment, accountability mechanism. And the third one is multi-stakeholder engagement. So in terms of legal interoperability, there's a few mechanisms we identified. The first one is harmonization, so which is about unification of laws. And the second one is the standardization, is alignment to a widely accepted regional or global principle, practice, or guidance in a specific field. The third is a mutual recognition, which means the 2 countries, they recognize each other's guidance or certificate or even the regulation. So they acknowledge that different national standards can be considered interchangeable for domestic applications. So this is called a mutual recognition. So then it's international collaborations. For example, the regulator from different legal regimes address the disparity and establish clear mandate. In terms of technical interoperability, there's a mechanism such as mutual consent through the adoption of the open standard, creation of the infrastructure for integrations, open source code, and policy intervention to advance interoperability, and the common protocols coupling between the hardware, software, and sharing of data, and adversary and interoperability. So those are the mechanisms for the technical interoperability. So practically, we generate our findings based on the 4 country reports. So these are the effective ethical interoperability instrument we identified across the 4 jurisdictions. The first one is a shared or common terminology. And actually, 4 countries shared similar ethical concerns in AI safety governance. So this alignment provides a foundational base for the ethical interoperability. For example, like South Korea, they emphasize AI safety, accountability, transparency, and privacy. China also, in terms of the AI safety, they also talk about the human-centered ethical framework and the values such as fairness, justice, transparency, accountability, and human dignity. And the UK, they have 5 core principles: safety, fairness, accountability, contestability, adaptability, and ethical norms. Singapore talk about the safety, accountability, transparency, and protection. So we can see some convergence, like accountability, transparency, human rights. Even China uses a human-centered ethical framework. They try to avoid use of human rights. So the other thing is about the course to international and institutional ethical assessment and accountability mechanism. And interestingly, we found the 4 governments, actually they use the layer. So all of them use the layer system to enable AI development under the relatively clear defined ethical boundary. When we say layered system, it means they combine like a legislation, industry-specified rules, and adaptive ethical guidance to build a AI safety governance ecosystem. So they are not relying on one instrument like a legislation. None of them actually legislation only. So most of them actually have a legislation, rules, industry-specified rules, and ethical guidance. And internationally, and all of them actually try to attempt to align on that domestic initiative with global governance frameworks. So those global norms are actually quite important from our finding. And actually they can integrate diverse national values, provide common reference for assessing AI practice. And the third one is the multi-stakeholder engagement mechanism. All of them, including China, South Korea, UK, and Singapore, they talk about the multi-stakeholder engagement mechanisms. So in terms of this is in terms of regulatory interoperability instrument, we found first of all, the standardization is quite popular. So the state align their regulatory framework with global, regional recognized normal benchmarks. So those benchmarks actually they include the global and the regional benchmark. For example, look at in the cross-border data domains. So the benchmark applied by those states actually include the GDPR and also their mechanisms. For example, like adequacy decision making and the continuity of protection principle, which is adapted by Korea and also UK, and the data classifications and G7's DFFT and OECD's data governance principle, UNESCO's of course. And also interestingly, I think many people may not pay attention to the global CPPR, the cross-border privacy rules, which is actually evolved from the APEX cross-border privacy rules originally, but they are trying to developing towards a global data transfer framework and certificate systems. So all of the four jurisdictions, they are either it is member or observer. China is an observer. The three of the other countries actually is the member of the global CPPR. So in terms of education, the benchmark goes recommendation on the ethics score, and also the global education coalition on AI. So in terms of autonomous vehicles, the predominant one is the UNEC is AP29. Sorry, it's AP29, not AP20. So this UNEC is World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations. So all the jurisdictions adapt to this alliance, their regulation, domestic regulation to the UNEC's WP29. So harmonization means establish unified regulation through the bilateral and the multilateral agreements. So this is not established yet because it's difficult to establish the harmonization or unified regulation. Most of the harmonization occurred through the digital trade agreement. For example, China joined the digital trade agreement as well as UK and Singapore and South Korea. So most of the harmonization happened through the digital trade agreements. Of course, for the autonomous vehicles, it's mainly through the UNEC's WP29, as I just mentioned. And for the education, except the UK, most of the country hasn't done a significant harmonization process, but UK is negotiate bilateral and multilateral agreement. And other things, collaborations. Collaboration is quite popular among all these four jurisdictions, given the difficulties in terms of harmonization, in terms of the standardization. So collaboration is quite popular. For example, they have this all the AI summit, China, South Korea, UK, different multilateral forums. So this is very popular for all of them. And China, and in terms of autonomous vehicle, China and Germany also signed a joint statement of intent on collaboration of the autonomous vehicles. And education, China's participate and the UNESCO's Global Education Coalition on AI and extras. So in terms of technical standardization, I have to say, actually the technical standardization are the most, I think, prominent across the four countries, especially for the Chinese interoperability practice. For example, in terms of cross-border data flow, China actually adopt many global technical standards. I just give some examples. For example, TLS 1.3 for encrypted transmissions, and they also adapt the ISOs and other standards. So they're very active in adapting alliance with the global standard, technical standard, South Korea and the UK as well. And especially for the autonomous vehicles, I think this is really a hot field at the moment. In the beginning, we were thinking maybe China was very keen, is very keen in developed autonomous vehicles. And actually, after we finished our investigation, we found that not only China, South Korea, and the UK, they are also very active in terms of standard development or standard alignments of the autonomous vehicles. And the self-education is not really developed yet because it's really new, very new to apply AI in education. Is still under development field. So collaborations, so it's mainly through the participation in the international or global standard organization like ISO, ITU, IEC. So all of them are very active to participate in standard settings. And another interesting finding is about the creation of infrastructure integrations. So South Korea invests in technical infrastructure for cross-border data flow to secure the international network links and account management under the principle of a secure data corridor. So basically, they have a hard pipeline for data exchange, and they have their own crypto VPN collections and a mutual audit. So they want to create a kind of infrastructure as a secured data corridors. And recently, if you pay attention, I think it's IEEE, they're also developing kind of the corridor, transporter data flow corridors to build up a standard to secure the cross-border data flows. So this is a kind of infrastructure creations. And Singapore have the AI verified toolkits, which help companies assess the responsible implementation of the AI system against the international recognized AI governance principle. So this is the AI verified actually is aligned with the international framework such as EU, GC, OECD, and the US as well. So after we identify the effective instruments, so the next step actually we was doing is to identify the barriers. So interoperability barriers. In terms of ethical barriers, we found there's several barriers include challenge in algorithm transparency and accountability, and then limit the universality of international ethical framework, voluntary nature of the ethical principles, and the uneven maturity and the implementation of AI standard. Because I do not have time to go through all of them, so you are welcome to read the details in our report, because I want to focus on our policy recommendation. So in terms of technical interoperability barriers, so there's a overlapping of efforts among the international AI standard body. As you can see, we've got the IEEE, ISO, and also the EU level. We have EU standard bodies and also the ITU as well. And the second barrier is focus deployment, safety assurance. So because the ANF servers have a development, deployment, and also the measurements, most of the technical standard actually is focused on the deployment phase, not in the development phase. So that is a kind of barriers. And also as a gaps and a frontier risk mandate. So in terms of regulatory interoperabilities, there's a lack of the global regulatory standardization. We have a lot of regional. At the global level, actually, we have some, as I say, GDC or the two resolution, but they're very abstract. They're not operationalized. And the second barrier is geopolitical tensions undermine the frontier AI safety collaboration. And the regulatory harmonization through the digital trade agreement, just as I mentioned before, most of the harmonization actually is through the digital trade agreement. But digital trade agreement cannot actually address the issue for AI safety because the trade agreement is mainly about economical concern. they have some like a national security concern, but not really comprehensive and also focus on safety, and they don't have a mechanism to resolve all these issues. So therefore, this is some area we need to further address. And then in terms of the global, the CBPR, just I mentioned, the global data privacy framework, the new global data framework, we found that global privacy framework actually prioritizes the political commercial interests over the legal harmonization. So a lot of the voluntary framework, they're mainly concerned of the commercial interests because they're not really enforceable, not legally binding. So it's more about the commercial interests and the political interests. And the other two areas we found is quite significant. It's about liability framework for the autonomous driving. So the liability framework, that's still fragmented and diverse. So there's no harmonized or even standardized of liabilities. So this creates a problem, a huge problem for the industry. And also there's a limit international alignments in AI safety, in education, and we need to invest in digital public infrastructure. So now, so we move to so after we identify those barriers, then we based on our findings and the barriers, we provide some policy recommendation. But we would like to emphasize the two aspects when we provide the policy recommendation. First of all, it has to be a holistic approach. And secondly, is to align with the GDC. And of course, the main report is to try to create a mechanism to help shape the mechanism, interoperability mechanism to help the implementation of GDC and also to UN resolution. So the first policy recommendation is to leverage the existing effective interoperability at both global and national level. So you already know there's some very effective interoperability instrument, which sometimes they're used by different regions. So we can leverage this instrument. The other ethical recommendation we promote is a self-certificate report. So the UN should take a lead in convene, coordinate, and oversee the development of AI ethical self-certificate report mechanism. So basically, it's like a national government or regional body or organization. They could to submit their respective self-certificate reports. Just tell us the details, like how many accidents happened in terms of autonomous vehicle in the made. And so all this report is a kind of self-regulatory mechanism, but we need some coordination from the UN. And secondly is uphold the UN system as a primate forum for AI ethical deliberations. Of course, there's some reason why we want to propose this. For example, the Global South, they're not really happy about what's going on at the global level. And there's a gap between the power gap between the North and the South. Therefore, we propose a UN system as a primary forum for AI ethical deliberations. The third one is advance the global AI framework, because most of framework at that moment where there's non-binding, there's a word commitment. So we urge platforms such as the Global Dialogue on AI Governance and also the independent international scientific panels on AI can meet in propose some universal applicable ethical standard that can serve as a base for concrete, operationalized, and potentially binding international policy instrument, and supported by a clear, small-scale key performance indicator to track the progress, identify gaps, and also the cross-country and cross-organizations AI safety review. So in terms of technical we want to urge the country or the state to promote interoperability by design. So when we say interoperability by design, what means that to encourage to align their national standard with the established emerging international benchmark. So why do we need to have an interoperability by design? I think many of our colleagues understand the reason, because this can actually enable the industry to build a system from the very beginning to comply. So to comply for the different, across the different jurisdictions, because comply to the international standard. And so to facilitate the smooth integration of them into the global marketplace and the supply chains. So also secure the AI technology safe, ethical, and interoperable across borders. So this is a reason if the country and the government can encourage them to implement interoperability by design. And also the international consensus-driven AI standard avoid duplications, because many applications across the different international standard bodies. So we encourage international consensus-driven standard, but also to urge them avoid unnecessary duplication. And also to prioritize the development of dedicated AI in education standards. For example, they can achieve by have a technical specification for AI educational tools. And the other one we want to emphasize is prioritize the standard interoperability at the security level, because they have a different level in terms of the AI security, safety and security. So you can have interoperability at a technical level, for example, like the API. But I think the most important thing we propose is to prioritize the standard interoperability at the security level. So should we focus more on the security level, including, for example, security level actually to protect AI system and the data from harm, including accident, misuse, cyber threat, and common safety and security standard. And the other things, the final proposal is to call for the scenario planning for AI-related catastrophic risk and the regulatory forecasting. Because at the moment, there's a huge debate. We know the development of the debate. In the beginning, people talk about the catastrophic risk and the regulatory forecasting. Then we move to the more concrete risk, which is social risk. But at the same time, so the governance and the regulator development tools like AI verified toolkits, AI insurance sandbox, all these mechanisms. But at the same time, we propose that we need to also have a scenario planning and regulatory forecasting for model level controls. For example, oversight of foundational training data. So what kind of data used to train the models, and the safety features of the generated purpose AI, and the mitigation strategy for catastrophic risk, such as loss of control or dual use threat. For example, like a bioweapon or advanced cyber offense. Because at the moment, we haven't really touched these areas yet, but need the regulatory forecasting. Also, now most of the ethical guidance are soft. So whether we should have more enforceable and a durable, admirable obligation. So that's other issues we need to explore as well. In terms of the government's regulatory interoperability, in terms of governance, architect, and the coordinations, we propose some of our proposal, of course, is a bit controversial. And welcome your comments, because we will develop a follow-up report based on this report. So we will revise and update our report as well. For example, we propose to establish a multinational system for coordinated AI and data safety governance. So states can negotiate the creation of multinational system with designated institution or mechanism to coordinate a common approach. And also, this mechanism should uphold the UN Charter's principle of sovereign equality among the member states. The second one is establish a coherent national entity for global engagement. So if for the country and the state, if they want to effectively engage with the UN bodies or global partners, they should formalize a coherent national entity to decide a unified national approach. For example, like a National AI Safety Coordination Council. So to address regulatory inconsistent, represent the national interest in global AI governance forum. This may not be an issue for some countries, for example, may not be an issue for Singapore because they're small, and may not be for UK. But this is an issue for a country like China, South Korea, because they have a very fragmented AI safety governance system. So many government agencies involved in the AI safety governance and in the global engagement, which make a lot of the troubles. That's why we propose you need to have a coherent national entity for global engagement. And then to support inclusive multi-stakeholder engagement for AI safety. Because effective AI safety governance depends on inclusive mechanism. For example, multi-stakeholder engagement. Even China has a multi-stakeholder. They didn't call it multi-stakeholder, but they call it a multi-party engagement mechanism. So they need to build up a public trust. So you need to have a support from the different sectors in order to build up public trust. That's very important. And so we need to have both bottom-up participation and top-down coordination in shaping the AI governance, and enhance the public engagement to strengthen the international AI governance. The very interesting findings from the 4 countries report is that all of them recognize in order for you to participate globally, you need to have a very strong, not strong, but a coherent, very supportive domestic ecosystems. In order for you to participate globally, you need to have a kind of the coherent, supportive domestic AI safety ecosystems. So that's why the engagement of public is very important to strengthen the international AI governance. So in terms of standard benchmark and transparency, so this is a proposal we aim to improve the interoperability through the shared benchmark, transparency, accountability mechanism. For example, we propose to launch a global benchmark for AI safety and security. So to support regulatory alignments among the states, there's an urgent need to establish a global benchmark for AI safety and security to implement the GDC and other AI regulatory resolutions. And secondly, to enhance transparency and accountability in AI safety governance. This is very important to build up the public trust as well. For example, to strengthen the public trust and improve the oversight, country can develop the clear AI safety key performance indicators, such as autonomous vehicle accident rate, data breach incident rate data, or public trust levels indicators. And they can publish annual national AI safety report to help track the progress and inform the public, and also guide the refinement of policy, and also enhance the transparency in policy making by provide the reasoning why they make this policy. For countries like the UK, may not be a problem, but there is a support especially for China or even South Korea or Singapore. So they need a kind of public sharing of the reasoning, standard, and evidence behind the AI-related regulations. So regular AI policy evaluation and the annual white papers audit of key performance. And so this is a mechanism which can help to enhance the transparency and accountability of AI safety governance. And the other things we propose is promote adaptation of expansion of data interoperability mechanisms. So because there's an absence of unified global framework for cross-border data transport, so therefore it's important to encourage to adoption of effective mechanism we already observed. For example, like a standardization, harmonization, mutual recognition, and international collaborations. And also some mechanisms very effective, like a GDPR-styled adequacy mechanism. Actually, the GDPR-styled adequacy mechanism has been adapted locally by South Korea and also China and the UK. So they established their own adequacy mechanism in South Korea and in UK. And mutual recognition of AI audit, data protection, certification, test result, multinational dialogue, and shared of the best practice or pilot experience. Because like South Korea, China are very advanced in terms of the sandbox experimentations. So they already established so many different special regions or cities to have the pilots in autonomous vehicles. So it's sandbox regulatory approach. So they're quite advanced. So probably I think it's very useful. They can share their best practice in terms of the sandbox experimentation in autonomous vehicles and in the education as well. So this all the mechanism can force interoperability, reduce the redundance, compliance burden for companies. And because it's important for company, if one of the main purpose of the interoperability is to reduce compliance burdens for medium and small size AI companies, and to mitigate risk and lower cross-border frictions as well. The other things we would like to propose is additional protection to mitigate data flow risk. Because in the global CPPR system and the Asian model contract clauses, so these are the two regional mechanisms. They need to, these are voluntary, these are regional. As I said, one is from APEX, which is the developing, expanding to the global. The second is Asian countries. So these are voluntary. From the experience we export from the South Korea practice and also the UK practice, and the voluntary mechanism, which is not sufficient. So we need a more robust protection to safeguard cross-border data flow. For example, some ethical principle, we need to adapt it across the jurisdictions, such as fundamental right to travel with data, universal privacy and agility, and the GDPR's continuality of protections principles. So if you look at the Chinese practice, when the data left, it's all accountability mechanism to hold this received company accountable, which means they established the contract between the domestic Chinese company and the foreign company. But once the data left the countries, so there's no accountability to hold foreign partner accountable. So if there's a leak of the data and the Chinese citizen cannot actually seek remedies from the foreign companies. So it's different. This is a very differentiated approach from the GDPR and from the South Korea's principle. For example, like a fundamental right should travel with the data. So there's a universal privacy protections and the continuity of the protections principle and the GDPR. So this is something is very good practice should be promoted across the jurisdictions. And the next proposes developed interoperability in terms of digital public infrastructure. We give example is the state can collaborate and invest in digital infrastructure to enhance the global interoperability, particularly through the initiative like the standardized digital mapping of the road regulation for AVs, which is autonomous vehicles. So they need in international collaborations or to build up kind of public infrastructure in terms of digital mapping of the road regulation, because the AV cars, maybe they're made in Germany, okay, but they may be exported to China or South Korea. So they need to have some kind of the common and the public infrastructure in terms of digital road mappings and the digital mapping of the road regulation. So the company, the enterprise can understand how they can operate it in different jurisdictions, or whether they should have a harmonization of the like a liability. Or in what circumstances, who should hold liability if there's a car accident happened? Because sometimes it's the operator hold liability, sometimes it's the drivers. At the moment, like under the Singapore's jurisdictions, so it's more under the Ford, like a liability regimes, whether in Korea and the UK, it's more about liabilities that actually is on the operator of AI system. They are hold liability for any car incident. So maybe they need to have a coordinations and build up digital public infrastructures. And so this is also related to what I talked before. So developing great standardization and harmonization of liability models for autonomous vehicles, especially for the level 5, because at the moment, the autonomous vehicles at level 2 and moving to level 3. But the level 5 is the full autonomous vehicles. So there's an urgent need. It depends on how quick we will arrive the level 5. It may take quite a long time, or maybe take a middle terms and short terms. But in the end, we need to have some structured liability rules for fully autonomous vehicle system. So this must be collectively researched and addressed by states to ensure legal clarity, safety, and accountabilities. As I said, the car market is not on one country, it's across the jurisdictions. And so the last one is research and capacity building. So we need a collaborative in terms of the investment in AI safety, frontier risk management, and the research collaboration, and promote AI safety in education as well. So the conclusion of the report is that the future of AI safety governance is evolving towards an evidence-based, outcome-oriented model that complement the principle-led framework. So we already have a lot of the principle-led framework, but now what we need, the future AI governance is more evolved. It's towards evidence-based, outcome-oriented models. So this is actually reflect growing international consensus, increasing alignments with the global standard. So in order for the country, the state, to participate, to follow, or to active shaping the national, regional, global AI safety governments, for policymakers must prioritize that normative understanding. For example, like we talk about the ethical framework, the normative framework, and align with the global and the regional. And also to expand their adoption of interoperable standards, strengthen their data governance mechanism, and collaboratively invest in conduct research in terms of technical, institutional, and AI literacy capacity building. And in the end, actually, the AI safety and interoperability is a dynamic process. So public trust is very important for the foundations to develop AI safety, and interoperability ethics guide strategical directions. So regulation translate value into the enforcement rules. So you have the values, but you need to have a regulation. You transfer these values into the enforcement rules. And the standard actually is standardized enforcement of those regulations. So standard enforcement drives implementation. You use the standard enforcement to implement those regulations. And in the end, international collaboration amplifies the impacts. So together, all these elements form a resilience, inclusive and global aligned AI safety governance ecosystem. This is our preliminary conclusion base. And in the end, we want to acknowledge the whole research report actually is benefit from our two research assistants, and also the fundings from the SenseTime is an AI company from SenseTime. We also received some very useful comment feedback from those individuals. Okay, I think I stop here and give the time to David talk about the UK's cases as well. Thank you.
So thanks for having me. Firstly, I hope that you will read the report. As Professor Chin mentioned, this will be updated and hopefully other sectors and countries added. It is a work in progress, and I'll come back to works in progress in a minute. So regarding the UK, the report presents evidence that allows for two quite different interpretations of UK AI governance. And rather than choose one and dismiss the other, I think you'd probably like to hear both and understand where the tensions lie. So there's a compelling case that the UK is doing important, innovative work. The Autonomous Vehicles Act is genuinely good legislation, and the AI Security Institute, formerly known as the AI Safety Institute, is world-class. The UK's role in global standards forums is valuable and impressive. So UK is making a real contribution to this area of work on the global stage. So we can actually be quite proud of that. But there is also a serious case that the UK's governance model is fragmented, underfunded, relies too heavily on soft law and voluntary compliance. Education policy, for instance, is guidance-based, no enforcement mechanism. Data governance is balanced on what could be described as an unsustainable post-Brexit tightrope. And the regulatory landscape is so distributed that coherent policy is extremely difficult to achieve. I'll look at both views because understanding the tensions between them is where the real insights lie. So, has that gone on? Yes. Okay. So we'll have a look at the third way. Well, I say the promise and the risk. So let's start with the UK's core strategic choice, what it calls the third way. The UK explicitly rejected the EU's approach, which is to pass a comprehensive binding AI Act that applies horizontal rules across all sectors. It looks as if that, although that legislation has been looked at, legislation has been looked at, it seems to have moved to one side for the moment. It also rejects the US approach, which is largely to let the market regulate itself with sector-specific rules for health and finance. So that's the other end of the spectrum. Instead, the UK uses 5 high-level principles that Yik-Chan's already mentioned: safety, transparency, fairness, accountability, and contestability, and then tasks existing sector-specific regulators to interpret and apply those principles contextually, using the experts, really. So that theory is quite elegant. Different sectors have different risks. A self-driving car, for instance, poses a different kind of safety challenge than an AI recruiting tool. So rather than write one monolithic law, let the Department for Transport and the Information Commissioner's Office, the Department of Education, and others each apply the 5 principles to their own domain. So the promise of this approach is clear. So you have flexibility, adaptation, innovation, all things that are really good for us. You're not locked into a prescriptive rule book that becomes obsolete the moment the technology moves on. You can adjust as you learn. But the report, if you look carefully, also flags a critical risk: fragmentation. The fact is that different regulators have vastly different technical capacity, different legal authority, and different budgets. So the ICO, for instance, has investigative powers, can issue fines. Department for Education, it doesn't. The CCAV, the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, can issue guidance. But who enforces it if a manufacturer ignores it? Okay? So the report notes a potential gap is that not all sectors have mature technical standards. Education AI is still somewhat nascent in standards compared to AV. That's academic language, really, for parts of the UK system are genuinely mature and others are frankly a work in progress. So this is not necessarily a fatal flaw, but it means that the UK's third way is not yet a stable equilibrium. It's more of working towards a comprehensive framework. So let's look at a success. The Automated Vehicles Act 2024 is, by international standards, genuinely good legislation. It really is good. It sets a clear safety standard. Autonomous vehicles must perform as safely as a careful, competent human driver. It defines liability clearly. When a vehicle is in autonomous mode, responsibility shifts from the human driver to the authorized self-driving entity. This is crucial because it allows insurance and liability markets to function internationally. It mandates compliance with international standards, so ISO 26262 for functional safety, the UNECE regulations 145157 for cybersecurity. It establishes a licensing regime through the CCAV, so it commits to a lifetime oversight. And because the Department for Transport had political will, dedicated resources and clear technical standards to build upon, thanks to UNECE WP.29, this worked. And the UK AV framework is now aligned with German, Japanese, and other international standards. So a manufacturer can build to UK standards and reasonably expect to deploy in other countries. So that's a huge boost for us. But here's the cautionary note. AV succeeded because they had all these advantages. They had a dedicated regulator with legal authority. They had clear liability models to settle enormous political and legal question. They had a mature international standard to build upon. And they had public salience. Self-driving cars capture political attention in a way that, say, AI in recruitment doesn't really. So education AI has none of these things. It does not have a dedicated regulator. It's no clear liability model, has no mature international standard, and it has low political salience. So the AV Act, in other words, succeeds despite the broader UK governance model, not because of it. So just have a little look at education. So the UK's response to education AI is actually quite principled. So the government learned hard lessons from the 2020 A-level scandal that most of us will be familiar with, when an algorithm systematically underestimated students from state schools. The reaction was a public outcry and a government reversal. The Department for Education is committed to a strong principle: AI should augment teachers, not replace them. There should be no automated high-stakes decisions like exam marking or school placement without human review. So schools should conduct risk assessments. Age-appropriate design should be prioritized. This is good. This is the kind of thinking you want in education policy. But when you look at how this has been enforced, and the answer is it is not being enforced, it is guidance. So the DfE issued a non-binding guidance document. There is no legislation, there is no regulatory mechanism. A head teacher struggling with budget constraints who decides to use an American AI system that the Department for Education has not explicitly approved is not breaking the law. They might be contravening guidance, but there is no enforcement mechanism. So now I want to emphasize many UK schools are doing this brilliantly. They're conducting proper assessments involving teachers, thinking carefully about data privacy, but there are some that are not. And the report explicitly flags this. So guidance, not legislation, currently drives policy, fragmentation risk exists. So our report recommends that UK should move from soft law to code of practice, but there is no timetable for this, no enforcement mechanism suggested, as there are currently no resources available to do this. So in the case of education, it's not regulation, this is regulatory aspiration. And because different local authorities have different capacity, different resources, and different relationships with their schools, you end up with a fragmented landscape where the quality of AI governance depends largely on where you happen to live and how well resourced your school is. So for you, as the Internet Society audience, I want to emphasize this is a problem for interoperability. If UK schools cannot even agree on common standards for how they use AI, how can we possibly harmonize standards internationally? So now let's turn and have a look at the third domain that we looked at in the report, which is cross-border data flows. This is where the UK's post-Brexit strategy reveals some of its deepest tensions. Post-Brexit, the UK is in a genuinely difficult position. It needs to maintain an adequacy decision with the EU, otherwise data cannot flow from the European businesses to the UK without special protections. And I think we all agree that would be commercially catastrophic for the UK tech companies if the data stopped flowing. But it also wants to diverge enough from the EU GDPR to sign favourable trade deals with the US, Japan, Singapore. So the UK is pursuing what is called data free flow with trust, DFFT. Yeah. And the flagship example is the UK-US data bridge. So under that agreement, personal data from the UK can flow to the US, and rather than requiring explicit consent for each transfer or exhaustive legal agreement, US companies self-certify compliance with certain privacy standards. So there is an uncomfortable reality. The US has no general data protection law comparable to the UK GDPR. There is the FTC Act, Section 5 of which provides some privacy protection, but there is no overarching right to access your data, correct your data, or delete your data. So privacy protection in the US is fragmented across sector-specific rules. So HIPAA for health, FCRA for credit, CFAA for computer security. So when the UK personal data flows to a US cloud provider under the data bridge, it is entering a materially weaker regulatory environment. US companies are not subject to GDPR level obligations. The report acknowledges this obliquely when it notes diverge too far, lose EU adequacy status, commercial disaster. I think that's pretty clear. What this means is the UK is trying to maintain a precarious middle ground. It wants to be flexible enough to do deals with the US, but not so flexible that it loses the EU's trust. It is a genuinely difficult balance. So the big question is it sustainable? I would perhaps argue no, and here's why. So geopolitical tensions are rising. We just have to turn on the news and we can see that. The US is increasingly protectionist. China is asserting itself across technology standards, and the EU is hardening its regulatory stance. At some point, the UK will have to choose: align more closely with the EU or align more closely with the US. And that middle ground will collapse, or is in danger of collapsing. And when it does, the UK will discover that the DFFT model was holding together a fundamentally unstable arrangement. Companies will face a choice: comply with the EU rules or comply with US rules. The UK will effectively have to pick a side. The report notes this tension, geopolitical tensions affecting data flows in cooperation. That's diplomatic language, really, for the current system depends on assumptions about global cooperation that may or may not hold. So just a little bit about the AI Safety Institute. It's the AI Security Institute, was safety. So it's something the UK is genuinely doing well. So it's not all doom and gloom. AI is tasked with evaluating frontier AI models, so the GPTs, Claude 3s, and subsequent systems for dangerous capabilities before they're deployed widely. So this is very important, obviously. Technically sophisticated work, and the team is fortunately very skilled at this. The infrastructure is world-class, and we've got a great reputation. And it's impressive that the UK has committed resources to this when many other countries have not. But there's a critical limitation that the report identifies. Though it's somewhat buried, the AI-SI has no legal authority to enforce its findings. It can audit a model, it can produce detailed technical reports, it can advise policymakers, it can voice concerns in international forums. But if a company disagrees with its assessment, what happens? The AI-SI cannot deny a commercial license. It cannot issue a fine. It cannot compel action. It can only recommend. So this means that the AI-SI's power is soft power, relies on reputational pressure, on a company's desire to be seen as responsible, so embarrassing companies into compliance, and on government's willingness to act on its advice. So now soft power can be effective, as we know, but only under certain conditions. It works when there are multiple equivalent institutions across jurisdictions applying similar standards. If the UK AISI, the US, if the the US has an equivalent body and China has an equivalent body, and they all agree on safety standards, that creates pressure on companies to comply. That's where its power comes from. But the report flags critical vulnerability, geopolitical tensions affecting frontier AI safety collaboration, competition for technological and economic dominance, affecting geopolitical alignment. In other words, the US and China diverge on what constitutes dangerous AI. The UK's role as a neutral auditor becomes untenable. The UK will be forced to choose sides again. And in that scenario, the AI-SI becomes not a neutral global arbiter, but rather a tool of one geopolitical bloc or another. So what needs to change? Let me be direct about what needs to change. If the UK wants to sustain its governance model and its convening power, first and urgently, sector-specific regulators need adequate funding and technical expertise. Right now, the ICO is stretched thin. The Department of Education has limited AI expertise. The CCAV is relatively well-resourced for AVs, but that is the exception. Without proper resourcing, principles become words on a page. Second, education AI needs to move from guidance to binding legislation. A code of practice would be a step forward, but ideally you need actual law that creates liability, not just aspirational statements. Otherwise, fragmentation will accelerate. Thirdly, this is ongoing, the UK needs to clarify its post-Brexit data governance strategy. This means either deepening alignment with the EU and accepting some constraints on data flows to the US, or fully embracing the DFFT model and accepting the risk of losing EU adequacy. Right now, the UK is trying to have it both ways, and that is unsustainable. So the report captures this tension when it notes implementation remains challenging, particularly around licensing, enforcement, and public trust. So those are not minor issues. Those are fundamental questions that distinguish a good white paper from actual safety. Why interoperability matters. So let me connect this back to why interoperability matters and why the UK's governance model is crucial to whether global interoperability succeeds or fails. If the UK model works, if it successfully coordinates across sectors, funds, regulators adequately and maintains credible international convening power, then there is a path to global AI safety interoperability. Standards bodies, the ISO, UNECE, IEEE, have a neutral forum in which to do their work. Countries can share best practices, divergent regulatory systems can find areas of alignment. If it fails, if fragmentation deepens, enforcement mechanisms remain weak, and geopolitical pressures force the UK to choose sides, then we are heading towards a walled garden future. The US will have its standards, China will have its standards, the EU will have its standards, and the rest of the world will have to pick one. That is not interoperability. That is fragmentation with the appearance of coordination. The Internet Society's entire mission is built on the principle that open interoperable systems are better than closed ones. They're better for innovation. They're better for users. They reduce lock-in. They distribute power rather than concentrating it. But interoperability does not happen by accident. It requires countries to make binding commitments to shared standards. It requires regulators to coordinate across borders. It requires transparency and accountability. The UK has the technical credibility and the diplomatic positioning to lead on this. The AI SI is impressive. The AV Act sets a great example. The UK's participation in UNECE, ISO, and other forums is valuable, it's invaluable. But only if the underlying domestic governance system is coherent and binding enough to give the UK credibility when it advocates for interoperability internationally. So, three futures. What happens next? In the short term, the next one to 2 years, and I always talk around 1 to 2 years when I talk about futures, and the UK model will probably hold. Okay, so the AV Act will work, the AISI will produce good research, schools will muddle through, the UK will continue to be taken seriously in international forums. But in the medium term, 2 to 3 years, real tests will arrive. Education fragmentation will become visible when things go wrong. Data governments will be tested by geopolitical tensions, and regulators will face difficult cases where principles conflict and binding rules are needed. At that point, the UK will have to choose. Does it deepen binding law and enforcement, or does it accept a more limited role, a convener, an advisor, rather than a standard setter? So that choice will determine whether interoperability by design succeeds globally or whether we descend into regulatory fragmentation. So the UK's AI governance model is not a failure by any means, but it is not yet a success or a total success either. It is a genuine work in progress, ambitious, but vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And thanks for both of your presentations. A lot to digest. But let's open the floor for questions and comments. And the first one, I know that Martin has put his hand up, but there were some questions in the chat. And I wonder if Delphi Ramirez Ruiz is able to turn their camera on and their microphone and ask the questions they had very early on, about half an hour ago.
Dr. Yin Chan might know we shared together something in 2023 with the PNEI on artificial intelligence model, we share, I think, the same work that was in the summer of 2023. And I have two questions for her, which I have been writing on. Question number one is, why do we have to make a distinction between a tech layer and a security layer? Which is the real difference, speaking in technical terms, on security? Because I think that when you deploy something, security is always a layer in the tech community. So it's embedded on the tech community, number one. Second one, it's a question that arises lately in the Cybersecurity Forum from the United Nations, the EHF. That is, what happens when these civilian proposals are applied to non-civilian scenarios? Shall we ethically deploy a solution that can be used as a human use? Imagine there is a conscription in a territory, so these civilian people suddenly becomes non-civilian people. Do we apply the same ethical methods where they are civilian or they are non-civilian, they are conscripted? No, because these are the real things that the Charter of the UN expresses on the 5 first points, that we all expect for peace and we all expect for the friendly of nations. These two questions didn't appear clear to me on the proposal that Dr. Yin Chan, which I admire a lot, has made. Can we please say something about that? Can we break this difference between security layer and tech layer? To me, it's the same thing. If I'm deploying a tech solution, I always have security in mind. If I'm caring for a child, I don't have security in mind, but I'm caring for a child. So it's something embedded in human nature. And the second thing is, what happens when your condition as a civilian changes? We are in the United Nations talk, so this is something very clear that has to be exposed from the beginning. When you are a civilian person, but suddenly you have to act as a non-civilian person, how do we translate these things to autonomous machines? Thank you very much.
Just quick. The first question is actually when we talk about it is a technical distinction, because if you read the report, we did distinguish the AI infrastructure into different layers. The security layer is more about harms, like data harms or the attacks, this kind of we call the security layer. But the technical layer is more about interface. We talk about APIs or the application interface, interoperability. So we didn't say the technical layer is not important. We just say in terms of AI safety, interoperability, we should prioritize the security layer first. Then with the technical layer second. Yeah. The second question, because I was in the OEWG, so we had a huge discussion about the civilians, the duration of the weapon system and the change of, especially in the Ukraine war, the Russian-Ukraine war. So I think it's still early stage. I think we're still waiting for the OEWG or the follow-up mechanism to decide, because they haven't decided. So even in terms of not AI, even in terms of autonomous weapons, they haven't have a clarity on this point. So I think we will wait until they give us some guidance. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yik-Chan. Let's go to Martin Botterman.
Yeah, thank you for organizing this, first of all. A very prevalent subject. I really like the comparison across countries. But my question is in particular relating to David's assessment of the UK situation. What makes you believe that the UK might be in arbitrating discussion? It's even difficult for the EU as a whole, because the real powers and investments seem to be in US and China. And whereas we had some reason to trust US in the past in terms of collaboration, over the last, since this 9th of January, it seems to be less so, whereas Schrems is willing to is able to stop the GDPR recognition for US measures. I can see UK can't do it, but how can you rely upon that? And what role could the UK usefully play, knowing US and China are the giants, and EU already has a very difficult time to step up as a non-setter?
Yeah, great question. It's quite a long, there's a short and there's a long answer, really. The UK still retains some soft power, and they have stepped outside of, for better or worse, outside of the EU. So they are a significant sort of AI user, with lots of the technology came from the UK and all that. So they've got a good reputation. And I think they can provide something else. There are going to be, I mean, there's the geopolitical situation. There's also, in terms of the AI rankings, and obviously China and the US are far out in the lead, but there are several countries, including the UK, that are the next runners. So I think it does have the potential to be someone who can, or a country that can be part of that kind of arbitration between the people who are setting the agendas just purely because of their power. So I think there is a role there.
I hope so, because I do like the UK approach, to be clear. It's just in this world today, the geopolitical situation seems to be unlikely. But maybe you're an optimist, and people who know me know I'm an optimist.
I try very hard to be an optimist. As I say, we all turn on the news and see the way things are at the moment. So I think if you try and pull out some of that optimism, or look at some of the things that are done well and are going well there in this space, then I think we need to do that as much as we can.
Thanks so much, David.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question in the chat from Simon Hart. I don't know whether Simon is able to turn his camera on and ask us question, or maybe I should read it to the ring.
As if by magic, here I am. It's my first time on an Internet Society meeting, so thanks for letting me in. And it's a very interesting topic. I'd just like to talk about, when I was working in the civil service, all of a sudden there was a ban on installing TikTok on devices, because it was, and the argument given was that, on government devices, the argument given was that the Chinese government could just seize data because they have the power to reach into the pockets of any company operating within China and lift whatever they pleased. So that was part of what I was going to say. The other part is about GDPR. So my understanding of GDPR, or one of the fundamental parts of GDPR, was it was about, you had to give specific permission. You have to give specific permission you have to opt in. And I can remember there was an issue with, these may seem slightly analogous when I talk about these things, but there's scenarios where with recurring subscriptions, all of a sudden it wasn't deemed acceptable to be refusing to opt out. It wasn't so much the case that people would, there's subscriptions they pay for would automatically reoccur because you hadn't ticked a box that said opt out. You have to specifically opt in. And I think the bigger question is, in terms of people mentioning words like harmonization and so forth, and in the spirit of the Internet Society, I completely understand what that means. But in terms of our data, if our data is being used as our data has value and it's flowing around, in terms of harmonization or even homogenization, what does that mean in terms of intellectual property? I think that's where I'm coming from in terms of the questions I have, is because with GDPR, people have to be compliant within the supply chain as well, don't they? So I'm trying to understand how this works. And I know people were mentioning earlier about the short term and then the medium term. I'm just wondering, knowing having worked in the legal system myself at various parts, as well as moving into IT, whether we're just sort of one case law precedent blowing up away from some sort of shutdown of data and all sorts. I'm looking at the situation thinking, knowing what I know about that system, particularly about how all the loopholes work, and eventually things will get so bad that some drastic action will have to be mandated. And then we end up in a situation where we're panicking. It doesn't feel, for me, being a UK person, just feels quite uncomfortable.
There's quite a lot there to unpack, really. That's a bit of a smorgasbord of things. But one of the things that, kind of from what you've said, data is very precious. This is one thing that I think in the last few years, people are starting to realize, that their own personal data really is. No, there's lots of data that is very precious, all the data to do with our work and everything, but your personal data is something that is very precious. And there are a lot of people around, as we know, who want to mine that data to target their products towards you or find out things about you that, and without getting to, I'm a bit of an optimist, without getting too paranoid about things, there are a lot of our data is regulated fairly pretty well. Obviously, when there are problems, it hits the headlines. But by and large, and one of the good things we have is we have equivalency. The UK GDPR is equivalent to the EU GDPR at the moment, who obviously are a major trading partner. So that makes things very easy or easier. The US UK data bridge was an achievement, but it's not perfect because the US has that kind of struggle for the words, but a kind of less stringent regulatory environment. So we have to be cautious. China is different and they have a different approach to dealing with data. And of course, they have a different way of governing. Apps or whatever operating out of China are going to be held to different standards than in Europe or the UK. That is the world we live in. But what some of this work is about is trying to get people to basically cooperate with each other, the interoperability, to make things better for everybody. And I think if we can get to a point where we have agreements and that people are abiding by, that's going to be really good. That's going to be really good for trade. That's going to be really good for the prosperity of everywhere in the world. And Yik-Chan mentioned the Global South when she was speaking. That is something that we need to look at quite carefully because we do tend to have this, as a lot of people on the call know, this kind of north-south divide in terms of data. And if we can get safe flows of data, then that is going to help everybody. So I haven't answered everything. You really have opened up a whole range of things there that we could go into in quite a lot of detail, but hopefully that addresses your GDPR.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, David. We are actually running out of time, but you mentioned this cooperation and this interoperability. I had one burning question just before we close. Given that the current largest actors in AI are in the private sector, how is this mode of state-governed cooperation going to work out? We've seen on the internet the lack of interoperability between apps, between chat systems, etc. Is that possible?
Yeah, in 30 seconds. We hope so. And I hope that some of the large tech companies will actually see that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages of cooperating more. And we've seen this. We've seen where the EU clashes with a tech company or so. Nobody ends up winning in the end because it may change something, but it can have an unexpected knock-on effect. Yeah, it is actually a very complex question, but we are hopeful. And I think reports like this, we're chipping away, we're putting the ideas out there, we're trying to encourage governments to look more at this kind of issue. So I think every little bit counts.
Thank you, David. And Yik-Chan, closing words.
Yeah, I think in the end, it's the political will. It's really the political, but the main problem is geopolitical tensions. So it's political will. Once you have a political will to collaborate, it will happen, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. Thanks for sharing this report with us. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording of this session will be put on the internetsociety.uk website. So thank you. Very interesting indeed. I hope that you've all enjoyed this session. And I wish we could have made it a bit longer, maybe forecast a longer session in the future. But then again, there's always a next time. If you or anyone on the call or anybody who are watching this have any other ideas for topics that we could discuss, that we could have as a webinar and then a discussion afterwards, please email us at contact@internetsociety.uk and we'll consider it and we'll look forward to this. In the meantime, The next thing that will happen in London, I understand, is autonomous vehicles in 2026. So maybe it's not all just theory. We'll find out how it actually works in practice. And with that, thank you very much, everyone. Have a very good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are in the world. And of course, have a very good evening in the UK. Goodbye.
Excellent.
Bye-bye, Olivier.